Well, good evening and welcome. You guys are the ones who survived the free candy being handed out in the parking lot. I'm a little bit jealous of the free candy, and so after service, I'm going to be running straight down this front middle aisle to get to that candy before they close up shop, because nothing can stop me from candy, right? As my waistline will slowly increase and tell you about it. But good evening and welcome to the 6 p.m. service. I believe the Lord has led you here tonight, and He has a message from the 10 Commandments that we're going through tonight. We're in the series. We're in the third commandment, which is to not forget the Sabbath. So, I have a very long introduction, but hang with me as I share stories and kind of give some background here on the Sabbath and what does it mean. And I put this picture up here, jealous of Judaism or jealous of the Jews, because and I wrote this sermon, about 5-6 weeks ago, before all the stuff that's going on currently in the Middle East. And afterwards, during question time, I'm happy to talk more about what's going on and how we as Christians can respond. But about 4 years ago, my wife and I went on a trip to Israel. It was a trip that we just planned myself, and we went there, and it was no tour group. It was just small group like us. And we just meet people along the way, and it was a very fun, challenging trip. But part of it was one of her coworkers had a rabbi who lives in Jerusalem, and he actually runs a synagogue, but he welcomes outsiders to come experience Shabbat, which is Sabbath, or in Israel. And so it's Friday night at sunset till Sunday night at sunset is Shabbat. And so my wife and I, we journeyed over there. Now, I didn't know anything about Shabbat or service or whatnot. And we go over and we meet him at the synagogue. And it turns out his synagogue's a very traditional synagogue. So men and women are separated by a wall. So I was like, oh my gosh, my emotional crutch is gone. My wife is gone. We go over there. They hand me, they hand me a Bible, but a Hebrew Bible, and it's all in Hebrew. And then the whole service is in Hebrew, and I'm just sitting there like, at that time I didn't actually read Hebrew, I didn't know Hebrew, and it was a good experience. But if you've ever been to another country and they speak a whole different language during church service, it was literally all Greek and Hebrew to me, you know. And so what ended up happening is after the service, though, he and his family said, what we would like you to do is come home with us. So come to our house and share a Shabbat meal with us. So we did. We walked back with them, and we get home. We get to his home, and if you don't know, the Jewish people, they pre-cook their whole meal, so they don't do any cleanup. Legitimately, when it gets to Friday night to Saturday night, they do almost nothing. The lights that you need on your house are already turned on because you can't turn on a switch, and it's just a whole thing. In any case, we sat there, we conversed, we did politics, religion, ideas. He was fascinated that I was an evangelical Christian, and he was like, whoa, I've never actually had one in my house before. So we had really good conversations there. And we just kept talking and talking and talking, and there was no clock, so we didn't know what time it was. And we finally said goodbye, and he's like, where do you need to go? He's like, no cabs are going to come, so where do you need to go? And we gave him our address. He's like, okay, to get there, my wife and I will walk you about half of a mile, and then we'll point you on a street and just follow that street till you get home. And we're like, great. So we talk, and again, we're just talking as we go, and he finally says, all right, good night. Well, thank you so much. You know, we just exchanged pleasantries, and that's the first time I looked down at my watch, and it's 12:30 in the morning. And I'm like, holy cows, right? It's 12:30 in the morning, and all we have to do is a 2.5-mile hike all the way through Jerusalem back to our hotel. So here my wife and I start walking, and this is where I started getting jealous of Sabbath. Because as we were walking, 12:30 at night, we ran into other couples walking their babies. We ran into like 5 or 6 kids just hanging out playing ball. There was no cars. There was no noise. There just legitimately was quietness. And we walked 2.5 miles around. We got home just after 2 in the morning, and never felt unsafe. And it was I just remember going there. I remember seeing some single ladies, I don't know if they're single, but like ladies that are walking by themselves at 1 in the morning, down streets and through alleyways. And it just shocked me that there was a safeness of it, but there was quietness. And it was in that moment when I realized that legitimately the whole area, the whole of Jerusalem shuts down. There's silence, there's peace, there's quietness, that I was jealous of what the Jews celebrate. And he wrote a book. I read the whole book, and it was all about Sabbath and how to take Sabbath and what a treasure it is. But frankly, I'm still envious of that. Back in the United States history, if you go far enough back, the whole country would shut down on Sundays. Like, if you needed to go to the supermarket, it was closed. Like, you were out of luck, right? And you had to go knock on a neighbor's door. But we took that day to just Sabbath. And now we live in a 24/7 culture, and we don't do that anymore. And man, don't I miss Sabbath? Because Sabbath means no cleaning, no chores, no TV, none of these, no interruptions, but just stillness. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the Sabbath, Shabbat. Now, trick question, when did God institute Sabbath? See, I figured Sabbath was introduced many early on in the New Testament, but in fact, Sabbath isn't even introduced until the wilderness journey. In fact, Abraham died. Moses was the first person. We get all the way to Moses before this idea of Sabbath is introduced in the Old Testament. If you've got your Bibles and you want to read along a little passage, we're going to look at Exodus 16. It's on page 52 in the Pew Bibles. If you brought your own Bible, we're going to look at Exodus 16, and we're going to look at why and how did God introduce Sabbath. So it's in the story of Exodus 16 when it's before the Ten Commandments come apart. And so again, it's Exodus 16, the whole chapter. I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit verses, and if you want to dive into it, I'd recommend reading the whole story. But it takes place about 1.5 months after the Israelites left Egypt. They were hungry, they were tired, they were cranky. Sounds like me after work when I'm hungry, tired, and cranky. But they're there, and they turn to Moses, and they're grumbling and saying, "We wish we were back in Egypt because we're hungry. We're going to starve to death." And they're angry. And if you pick it up in verse 4, the Lord says to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather every day a portion, that I may test whether they will walk in my instructions or not. And on the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as gathered." So he hasn't actually said the word Shabbat or Sabbath yet, but the idea begins with the manna. We're going to jump all the way down to verse 14, but it says, then what ends up happening, Moses tells the people, and in the morning, the people come out, and on this verse 14, on the surface of the wilderness, there was a dew, and when the dew left, there was a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. And when the Israelites saw it, they looked at each other and were like, "What is this weird stuff on the ground, guys?" They didn't know what it was. And Moses said, "This is the bread from heaven, which the Lord has given you to eat." And then Moses says, "Hey guys, collect it every day, and then on the Sabbath you're going to collect it." But then we're going to skip all the way down to verse 22. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, and then verse 23, Moses said to them, "This is what the Lord meant." This is the first time the word Sabbath comes to play into the Old Testament. This is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is the Sabbath observation, Shabbat, the holy Shabbat of the Lord. Bake what you will bake, boil what you will boil, and all that's left over put aside to be kept until the next day. And then they go on, some of them disobedient, and then they learn the lessons, but eventually they start learning that every single day God will provide them the bread, but the day before Sabbath, they were collecting double, get it all prepared, and then they would rest. That story is so familiar, we forget how miraculous it is that legitimately God is creating out of nothing bread. Out of nothing, he's creating. Does that sound like any other time in the Bible that God has created out of nothing? What's super interesting, and my point of giving this little back is twofold. One, God forced the people to Shabbat for 40 years. Because when they introduced this concept, they didn't understand it, and they were like, well, I'm just going to keep gathering every single day because they were used to working every single day in Egypt. So God forced their hand for 40 years to teach them the rhythm that collect, work 6 days, but on the seventh day, stop. He was forcing them to learn a rhythm of God. That's the first point. But the second point is God is actually redoing the story of creation every single week in the wilderness. He's creating out of nothing what they need so that they would recognize God as creator, and they would recognize that once a week they need to set aside time to worship God who sustains and creates them. That is where the foundations of Sabbath came from. Sabbath is an echo of the creation story. Because what we're going to see when we actually get to the commandment is, what did God do on the seventh day? He rested. He Sabbathed. And we're going to look at that when we actually get to the commandment. The last point I'm just going to bring in, and then we're going to look into the commandment when we get this all down, is the Sabbath in the Old Testament was a completely radical, crazy idea. Never done before in any other culture. I put this quote up here, and it's a good reminder of us. In a modern America, that's us today, the 5-day work week is so taken for granted, we forget what a radical concept taking 1 day of rest was in ancient times. A weekly day of rest has no parallel in any other ancient civilization apart from Judaism. If you look at every single culture throughout all of history, they never took a day off every week. We're in the United States. It's super fascinating. We're so used to having 2 days off a weekend, but that is a really new idea. When our country was founded, it was typical to work 7 12-hour days in 1776. All the way up into the 1920s, it was typical to work 6 days, 10 hours a day. It was only in the 1940s, it's been less than 100 years, that we have a 2-day work week. The Fair Labor Standards was passed by the national government, giving us a 2-day weekend. 2 days off is super crazy. It's something that's only been in existence for less than 100 years. And if you watch the news, people are saying, man, 4 days is too much to work. I only want to work 3 days a week, which great, that'd be awesome. But I say that to say the idea of taking 1 day off every week was crazy at the time of Judaism, and I'm going to argue it's crazy when you really apply it to us today. Because we take days off, but we don't Sabbath. A Sabbath is a day where I do no chores, no work, I take no phone, internet, technology. I take time out of my day and shut everything off to be with the Lord. Does that sound crazy? Like, is that different than a Sunday? Because if you're like me, a Sunday, I'm getting up, we gotta go, we gotta get to church, we gotta get a Bible study, we gotta go. That's not necessarily Sabbath. All right. So, Sabbath, created in the wilderness journey. Sabbath also is a crazy idea, but it's one that God instituted, and we're finally turning to the passage. So 30 minutes later, no, I'm kidding. 15 minutes later, we're jumping into the passage. If you've got your Bibles and you were at Exodus 16, just 2 pages over, page 55 is when we're actually going to dive into the commandment. And I'm going to put it up here on screen as well. So Exodus chapter 20, and we're looking at verses 8 through 11, which is the commandment for Sabbath or Shabbat. And starting with verse 8, it says, the commandment says this: "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male slaves, your female slaves, your cattle, or your resident who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord," see, he's quoting Genesis. He's calling back to Genesis. "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. For that reason the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy." So the commandment is actually a fairly short commandment. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And then the whole next 3 verses actually give 2 justifications of why should we keep the Sabbath and why should we keep it holy. The first one talks about who should keep the Sabbath. Is it just the priest? Is it the people? Who actually should do it? And it says, "For 6 days you shall labor and do your work, while the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work." So you shouldn't do any work. Your children shouldn't do any work. Your slaves or servants or hired workers, or in Arizona, your gardeners. Your cattle, your dog, your cat, your animals. Your guests and people who stay with you. Everybody on the seventh day should Sabbath. What God is saying is, you can't have people serving you on the Sabbath. You can't serve other people. Your animals need a rest. The land needs a rest. And for us who have kids, your kids can't clean up after you on the Sabbath, which is a dang, because at least when I was growing up, Sunday was for go out and mow the yard. I'm going to watch TV. That was like what Sabbath was, right? But it shows that God cares for all of creation, and this command is for all of creation. It's a universal need that people and even the earth needs to rest. We all need times of rest. We aren't designed for 24/7, 365, go, 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 go. So it's for everybody. That's the big thing. So keeping it holy is for everybody. But why? Why should we keep it holy? This is, again, an echo back to creation. If you look here in the verse, it says this: "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea that is everything that's in them, and he rested," Shabbat, "on the seventh day, and that's the reason the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it whole." It's interesting because later on in Exodus, there's actually a quote here where he'll go into it and say that it's supposed to be a sign because on the seventh day, God ceased from labor and he was refreshed. Shabbat. The best way to explain the Hebrew word here, I'm going to have you all practice with me. Ready? You're going to take a deep breath in and then release it, okay? It's like this. That's what Shabbat means. Just taking a big breath and a sigh of relief, of rest. God abstained or rested. What is crazy is, and I didn't really think about this, is, do you ever realize that God could have on the seventh day been kept creating? He could have been like, cool, ostriches. They're a little weird, but let me make another weird bird, right? And he could have kept creating on the 8th and the 9th and the 10th. But on the seventh day, he chose to rest. Same thing with the Israelites in the journey. He chose to not create out of nothing, bread one day out of the week. And this is where I want to apply it to us, and we're going to hit it home a little bit more. God chose to rest. Sabbath is a choice. And we'll talk that through in just a second. But let's ask this question. Do we even have to? Some of you are asking this question, do I actually have to Sabbath? Like, I know it's a commandment, but I'm a Christian, do I really need to Sabbath? Because if you're thinking of the story I'm thinking of, well, Jesus is walking through the fields of grain, and he's talking with his disciples, and his disciples pick up some grain, and they eat it, and then the Jewish people are like, well, Jesus, they broke the law on the Sabbath, and Jesus' response is, well, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. Oh. So do we have to obey this? Well, yes and no. It's not quite as straightforward as a no. It's not quite for a yes, because if you look in Jesus' life again and again and again and again, he actually stepped out of ministry and he took a rest from the people. Mark 16 says that so many people were coming that he said to his disciples, come with me to a quiet place and let us get some rest, or Shabbat. And we see that he also celebrated the Sabbath each week as well. I believe we as Christians are still commanded to celebrate Sabbath. But when Jesus said, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, what he means by that is we don't have to follow the man-made rules of Sabbath. Sabbath doesn't have to be Sunday. I had friends when I was living in Hawaii. A lot of my friends worked in the hotel industry. They could not. Sunday is the busiest day of their week. So Monday and Tuesday were their days off. So they would rest on Tuesday. And so that's where Jesus is saying, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying, hey, you still need to Sabbath because that's how our bodies are created. But if you Sabbath on a Friday, or you Sabbath on a Sunday, or a Tuesday, or a Wednesday, you're still fulfilling the commandment. And so he frees us from the man-made rules of what we can and cannot do and how far we can walk and whether we can turn lights on. But the commandment still stands. Honor the Sabbath because we need to do it. So here's the central idea that we're just going to drive this home the last little bit of the sermon. Sabbath, or rest, is a universal need of humanity, and it is a choice in our lives because it's supposed to connect us with God's work and sustain us, and it's still necessary. I like to read old stories. Now, you're looking up there, you're like, that's an old picture. It is an old picture. It's actually from the 1940s. But a missionary in 1930 was taking a journey into the jungle. And so he was going to a tribe to preach, and he ended up hiring some day laborers to hold his loads and journey into the jungle. So they set off from Cairo, but they set off at the major city center, and they headed into the jungle. And on the very first day, they went really fast. They actually went almost double the distance that he was expecting them to get the first day. And so he was super excited because he's like, man, it's going to be a week's journey. We're going to get there in like 3 days. This is going to be great. I can get things set up, get a little bit more time back. And so they were he and his company were very excited about this fast journey. Well, the second morning they all woke up, and their laborers just sat around and slept. And they said, come on, let's go. And they said, no, we can't go. Oh, come on, we got to get going. Oh, no, we can't go. Come on, we got a place to go. Why are we not leaving here? And they said, well, we went too fast yesterday. We went so fast that our souls we have to rest so our souls have a chance to catch up to our bodies. And the missionary writes, isn't that such an interesting truth? The whirlwind and rushing life that so many of us live is like the first day of those jungle tribesmen, running. The difference between them and us is they knew that they needed to rest to restore their life balance and their spiritual state. And too often we do not. And I was like, whoa, that was pretty profound. Sometimes when you're out in the middle of the jungle, you can learn some profound truths. If you're like me, I run from one thing to the next, from work to school to activity to this to this. Do we choose rest? How many of you have heard this? I'm too busy. How many of you said that? I've said it. Have you ever noticed our culture actually kind of idolizes busyness? Right? Like when someone comes up and is like, hey, can you do this? No, man, I'm too busy. I'm running. I got it. Okay. We're like, yeah, he's busy. He's productive. What if you came up to me afterwards, you're like, hey, can you do this? I'm like, actually, no, I'm just going to relax and not do anything today. Well, you're going to be like, well, you're lazy. Come on, right? We, as a culture, prioritize busyness, and we kind of idolize it. But let me ask this question. And I asked, after I was writing this, I asked this question myself. When was the last time you had a 100% day of rest? And I wrote that down, and I was like, can we go like a few years ago? When I say 100% day of rest, meaning you sat around, you played games, you took naps, you didn't turn on the TV, you played puzzles, you just hung out, and you worshiped, and you prayed, and you spent time with God and with others. Because many studies have shown that the more we rest, the more productive we are. The more we rest, the less likely we are to die of heart disease. And funny enough, the more we rest, the less likely we are to gain weight. Which I was like, but there's a balance there. But because when you're tired and exhausted, you overeat and gain weight. Sabbath is a choice. Well, has anybody have a calendar that looks like this? Yeah, right? Anybody with kids? Everybody with kids is like, I got a calendar like this, right? How do we do this in the modern age? Here's a good truth. You either take control of your calendar or your calendar will take control of you. My wife and I had to learn this. I do not Sabbath well. That is my downfall. She 3 minutes and I'm like running. And so, I had a house, we remodeled it, but while I was remodeling it, we were also pregnant and I was still going to school and I'm running full-time, things. And in the current house we're in, I'm still remodeling it and I'm remodeling, I'm preaching, I'm working full-time job on the end. And it's a lot, right? And I will tell you, there's a lot of conflict in our house until my wife and I learned and figured out that we were being run by our calendar because a lot of people were inviting us to cool things. But then 5 nights a week we were out, and then all Saturday we were out, and then Sunday we were running. And all of a sudden we started realizing we're exhausted. We're doing fun things, but we're exhausted because we're not resting. And especially with our newborn, I don't know if you know, we've got a 7-month-old, but one weekend we had 3 events lined up. So first one was at 7, the next one was at noon, and the next one was at 5. It was a lot of fun. Have you ever tried to do that with a 6-month-old who does not like schedules quite like that, right? We got to the end of it, we were like, never again. 1 activity a Saturday, that's it. Because we had to learn the rhythm of rest, learn the rhythm of Sabbath. So, can I give you the secret power? This is a super secret power of how to Sabbath. It's complicated, but I think you can handle it. Are you ready? Okay, this is it. Nope. Now, if you ever played Exploding Kittens, that's what that card, yeah, right? The gamers are like, yes, Exploding Kittens. A nope card. A nope card is a card that if someone does an activity, you can say nope, and it cancels out that activity. Don't believe me? Look at your person around you and say no. See how that feels. Go ahead, try it. No. It's a 2-letter word. No. If you got a 2-year-old, they love that word. But it's funny is we have to learn to say no. That's the secret to Sabbath. The secret to Sabbath is a 2-letter word, N-O, or if you want to say the word, nope. Because there's always things to go. I used to listen to some multimillionaires doing like TED Talks, and the one thing I always learned from them was that everybody has the same amount of time in their life, and everything has a time cost. If I want to work 5 extra hours for extra pay, that's fine, but that also means then that cost is coming from my 5 hours I can spend with my family. Right? Everything has a time cost. And so we have to start to say no, especially in the church where we can run. It's not bad things. Usually we're doing good things for God, but it doesn't mean they're great things. If we turned off the TV and we just did our chores on a Thursday, it might open up a Friday or a Saturday where we can just rest. And the last one on this one with my nope card is, here's a good idea. Implement a no things day or nothing day. I mean, a calendar like this is crazy, right? And we are just starting with kids, right? And that's going to get even worse, and I know it. But once a month at least, can you circle a day and say, this is a do nothing day? No chores are allowed. No nothing is allowed. We are just going to rest. And in order to do and make a choice to have a restful day, that does mean ahead of time you have to prepare them food, you have to get your chores done, you have to get the yard work done, you have to get all of those things ahead of time done. It takes a lot of prep, but then when you get to it, you can have a nothing day, a nope day, a restful day. Sabbath is a universal need. Regardless if I want to admit it or not, it's a universal need. It's why I'm still jealous. Every time I think of Israel, I think of that day where we just walked and it was quiet. But if God, who created the universe, created man out of nothingness, chose to rest, he didn't have to, but he chose to rest, then shouldn't we take from his example and choose to rest as well? And I think if we grow in our choosing to rest, we're going to start finding more joy, more peace, more connectivity with God, and more connectivity with people around us, because we're no longer stressed and running. And especially in our culture, we need to learn to Sabbath and obey this command that says to keep the Sabbath holy. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for the command to Sabbath, and give us wisdom to say yes and wisdom to say no, that we would find rest for our souls and rest for relationships with others as well. We thank you for all your goodness, kindness, and love in Jesus' name. And all God's people said, amen.